Greetings all. I hope this finds you well. I've lost track of what time it is. I don't know what day it is anymore. But hopefully whatever it is will be over soon and we can move back toward having a more normalized life anyway. So, as I said, this is going to be lesson 8. And the name is the End Times, a Prophetic Panorama. I'm going to read the lesson overview and to give us a little understanding of what this lesson. I hope you read this lesson and some of the scripture at the end. I think it kind of opens this up. So anyway, without further ado, the lesson mentions many of those same historical events covered in the previous lessons. In reading Daniel 10 through chapter 12, it is important to note how the Jewish people were affected by foreign kingdoms. These chapters dig even deeper into the struggle of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The fulfillment of these details seen in historical events should not be the focus of this lesson. However, focus instead on how God fights on behalf of His people and on the need for His people to be faithful. And Christians can sometimes lose sight of the truth that the Jewish people still have a place in God's plan. I can't believe that people would think that, but some people do. And also, these visions point to how God will work through world events to draw them to salvation through Jesus the Messiah. Our key verse is taken from Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And we know that that goes right along with our New Testament readings. I have made notes on this lesson. I've tried to, in order not to read the whole thing, I've tried to boil this thing down to the important facts, but just keep in remembrance all of this, that this is focused on Daniel and more especially on Daniel's prayer and his life of prayer and his expectation that God would do what He had said He would do. And so, I'd like to go back to a little thing that we discussed last time, and that's on the 70 weeks of Daniel. And why 70 weeks? Well, it's not exactly put that way in Scripture, but we know that when it's added up, that's the amount of years that they would be in captivity. They're called the diaspora, which means spora is a seed, which I guess you would say that they were seeded throughout the known world at that time. If we go to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 21 and following, I'm not going to turn to that, but if you just if you read that for yourself, I think you'll get a very good idea of what was going on in Israel at that time and how they had broken God's commandments, and He had promised certain things would happen to them if they broke His commandments. Also, we read that they broke the Sabbath. As you know, there was supposed to be a Sabbath every 7 years, and at the end of 49 years, there was a great Sabbath. And I won't go into all that, but because of the breaking of those Sabbaths, God said that He would cause the land to rest for the same number of years that His people had ignored His teaching. So with that, we're going to move on. If you excuse me, I'm going to kind of get to my notes here. We see, beginning in chapter 10, that Daniel is troubled. And he's troubled, I would think, by the position of his people and what's happened to his people. And also, as we talked about it last time, we know that he knew through the writings of Jeremiah that the time had run out, and it was about the time for God to call the children back to Israel. So Daniel's answer to this trouble was to go to his knees, and as the custom was in those days, it says in sackcloth and in ashes. And so Daniel prayed for 3 weeks. And after that 3 weeks, Daniel received his answer. His answer came in the form of a powerful vision, a vision that was so powerful that it literally took the strength from his body. The scripture tells us that he fell prostrate, face forward on the ground, and fell into a deep sleep. I believe that this is when he received the vision. And we see that many times in the Old Testament, that visions came during a time of sleep. So when that had ended, a messenger came. Daniel told the messenger, I'm not strong enough to get up and to speak with you. So the messenger helped him. And it was, to me, it's a funny thing that there were 2 different parts of this help he gave him. First, he helped him up to his hands and knees. And the second time, he touched him again and raised him up that he stood on his 2 feet. And I'm sure as we read, he was in great fear. But the messenger said what we read a lot in the Old Testament. And as Jesus once often said, fear not. And he told Daniel, for thou art beloved. And so Daniel knew at that time that he was come to help. The messenger, we believe, are 2 different. The first part of his vision, we believe that he saw a vision of Jesus. And also, if we look in book of Revelation, in chapter 1, we see something is almost identical to that same vision that he saw. But this helper, this messenger that came to him, many believe was an angel. And which angel we don't know because he doesn't give his name. But he tells Daniel that he had started out, that he had been sent when he began praying. And he was hindered by a conflict that he had with a prince, an evil prince of the darkness. So, let's see here. So, beginning verse 12, we read of a curtain being pulled back, showing us a glimpse of an unseen world. We see, as he told Daniel, of a war that was going on, a spiritual war. And as we're told also in the New Testament by Paul's talked about the principalities and powers, the rulers of darkness in high places, that there was a war going on there. And then also we're told again in Ephesians 6:11 that we have a warfare, but it's not a carnal warfare, it's a spiritual warfare. And God tells us to put on his whole armor, put on the whole armor of God, and he outlines all the pieces of that armor that we do battle in that spiritual war. Following in Daniel's vision is a panorama of 3 kingdoms that were to come. The first kingdom was the kingdom we call the Medo-Persian kingdom. At that time, the king of the Persian Empire attempted to attack Greece, and this attack failed. This led to the rise of Alexander the Great, and as we know, most of us history people know that Alexander conquered the whole known world at that time. And I was reading that, and I was just wondering it seemed like at that time they may have had a one-world government which we read may come later. But at any rate, so Alexander the Great was killed. Well, he died actually from unknown causes. But after his death, his kingdom was divided by his 4 generals, each one seizing a part of Alexander's kingdom for themselves. Well, as people are and as people do, the 4 kings fought, and 2 of the kings rose to the top, and so there were 2 kingdoms. We read about those 2 kingdoms, and those are the kingdoms of the north and the kingdoms of the south. The kingdoms of the north are the Seleucids, and that is the kingdom of Syria. The kingdom of the south is the kingdom of the Ptolemy, and that's the kingdom of Egypt. And at this time, Israel was caught in the middle between these 2 kingdoms. And many times the kings of Israel chose to ally themselves to either, usually with the king of Egypt or one of those. And it seemed like Israel always chose the wrong kingdom to align themselves with, and it always caused them trouble. But they didn't know at the time that this trouble was in the hand of God, and it was not their trouble, but it was his trouble that he was making for them. So as we go further, we find that the leader of the kingdom of the north was a man called Antiochus Epiphanes, and Epiphanes means madman. And as we describe this, I think you'll understand why. So Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, decides that he will attack Egypt. Well, in attacking Egypt, his attack fails. And so, returning from his attack, he decides to go through Jerusalem. Well, along this way, he is leaving what we are known as a Hellenistic culture, which is the culture of the Greeks. And so when he sees the Jewish culture, he wants to transform that from the worship of the Most High God into the worship of the Greek gods. So for a time, the people like him and he finds advocates. But eventually he goes into the temple and slaughters a pig on the in the altar of the temple. Not only that, but they boil a pig and they take the broth of that pig and they pour it on the vessels of the temple, defiling them. So then we read in Daniel about the first abomination that makes desolate. So at that point they can't worship in the temple because it's made sinful, because of obviously the pig was something that the Jewish people didn't eat, and it was an offense not only to them but they believed to God. So this time frame of this was during what we call the intertestament period between the Old and the New Testament. And this ended with the rise of the Maccabean family. And the Maccabees were called the Hammer. And they fought against the Seleucid king, and they were able to throw them out of Israel and cleanse the temple and restore temple worship and sacrifice. However, I almost forgot this. They restored the temple sacrifice and they restored temple worship, but there was no Ark of the Testimony, or what we might call the Ark of the Covenant, because that had been taken in the first taking away of the people by the Babylonians. The Ark was taken, and many of the vessels of the temple were also taken. So then we come to chapter 11. And this part of Daniel's vision moves to the end of the age and the time of the book of Revelation. And we also find during that time we have the rising of the Antichrist. Now, he will also be a king, and he also will profess himself to be God. And he'll have success for a time, but at the end of the Great Tribulation, during the Battle of Armageddon, which is, we read in Revelation chapter 19, he will be destroyed. In chapter 12, we are told that Michael the archangel will stand up for the Jewish people at that time. And we're also reminded in Romans chapter 11 that God's people, the Jewish people, are the olive tree, and they are the root. The Christian church is a branch. We're grafted in, and Paul reminds us not to boast against the root, because if he's able to take the root out, he's certainly able to cut the branch. So, for whatever that. We read that during this time, the resurrection of the righteous will happen. Some to everlasting life, and those who rejected Christ to everlasting shame and punishment. Those who are still alive at that time, who lead others to Christ, are said to shine as stars. And in chapter 12, verse 4, Daniel is told to seal the book. We don't know whether he fully understood the total of the prophecy he was given. I think probably he did. I can't imagine that God would send an angel without revealing the whole thing to him. But be that as may, he knew that from the prophets of Jeremiah and Isaiah that God was true to his word, and that he had seen prophecy fulfilled even in his own life. And he knew that God would look over his word and he would accomplish it as his purpose. Daniel's vision, as we read, is continued in Revelation, in the book of Revelation. And as you know, we're told to read that book and to understand it as best we can, because the days are growing narrow and the time, I believe, is short at hand. So I hope you enjoyed it. I really missed the questions. I like to hear people's own ideas about Scripture. I think it's enlightening to each of us. And I know God's blessing you, and I know we miss one another and hope to see each other shortly. So with that, I say God bless you and keep you, and we love you and look forward to seeing you later. Bye-bye.